Welcome to everybody around the world and to all my subscribers. Today I'm going to go through Critias and Timaeus and read what the actual location of Atlantis is, because there's a lot of theories out there, like it was Malta or that it was Antarctica. A lot of theories, but these do not conform at all to what's actually written in the text. So I'm going to read the portions from the text that actually help pinpoint the true location of Atlantis, so we can put all those theories to the side. So if we look at the Critias, okay, Plato says, "Let me begin by observing first of all that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war, which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside the Pillars of Hercules and all who dwelt within them. This war I'm going to describe. Of the combatants on one side, the city of Athens was reported to have been the leader and to have fought out the war. The combatants on the other side were commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which, as was saying, was an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, and then afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers, sailing from hence to any part of the ocean." So we have the first clue there, that it was bigger than Libya and Asia. And when I show my map, my little map that I've drawn out here, which is pretty much to scale, we'll see where the true location is. And I'll show, see, ancient Greeks had a different concept of what was Libya and Asia. So I looked up the ancient Greek map for Libya and Asia, and they used to call the upper east of Africa Libya, whereas today Libya is more over towards the centers more. So they used to call, I think, what we now think of as Egypt as Libya, and then over into, I think it's, anyways, I'll show you on the map. So it's not as big as some people think. It's not like the whole continent of Asia. It's what the ancient Greeks thought of as Libya and Asia. So that's the first hint there. Now, if we scroll down to save reading out the massive portion of this text, I did that the other day and it took about an hour to read everything. We will also find out, if I can find it as I'm scrolling, but we also find out in the text that the Atlantic Ocean was named after Atlas. Atlantis was named after Atlas, and the ocean subsequently was named Atlantic. Okay, so that's two things as well. I mean, it tells us that it was an island in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so that rules out Antarctica and Malta. And for somebody to say that all these ice ages passed and the continent drifted or something, like, that's just not possible. It is completely geologically impossible for a continent to move that far, especially within just 9,000 years. And also, that's 9,000 years since a war took place. It does not. We learn also in the text, I'll try to locate them as I talk, right? But we also learn in the text that there are many floods that assailed Atlantis, but only the great flood of Deucalion was the one that wiped it out. And we read that there's so much rain came down at one time in like one day or one night that it washed away all the like clay and mud that made up a lot of the surface. So once all that had washed away into the ocean, there was just bare rock beneath, and also an earthquake hit it. So this is what we learned. So the next important thing that I'll mention, actually to do with location, is we can find, if we scroll down here, right here, I'll read the paragraph where it introduces it, okay? It says, "Now the country was inhabited in those days by various classes of citizens." And it goes on for a little while. I don't have to read all that out. It says, "Concerning the country, the Egyptian priest said what is not only probable, but manifestly true, that the boundaries were in those days fixed by the isthmus, and that in the direction of the continent they extended as far as the heights of Citharion and Parnes. The boundary line came down in the direction of the sea, having the district of Oropus on the right and with the river Asopus as the limit on the left." So that's a geographic location description. Okay. Now I interpreted it as follows. Those locations, Cytharion and Parnes, are locations in Greece. And as Plato explains later in Critias, many of the place names in Greece were named after Atlantean ones. Okay, so I mean he explicitly says that. Now this is an example. Cytheron and Parnes are two places in Greece, but what I noted is that Cytheron is 1,500 miles from the Straits of Gibraltar, which is what they called the Pillars of Hercules. Okay, so what Plato has said here, he says, in that in the direction of the continent they extended as far as the heights of Cytheron. Okay, so if we take that distance of 1,500 miles from Cytheron in Greece to the Pillars of Hercules, and then extend 1,500 miles out from the Pillars of Hercules out into the Atlantic Ocean, we get the following location. Okay, this is roughly to scale here. So we got C is the Pillars of Hercules, D is Greece, which is where Cytheron is, right? Then B is the set distance calculated, and A is New York. So if we go from New York to the Pillars of Hercules, it's 3,600 miles, right? So if from C to D is 1,500, and we learned that, where is it? Where does he say it? Anyways, there's 1,500 miles out from their starting point to the start of the continent. So this is the eastmost location of Atlantis. It can't be any closer, according to what Plato has said. And we know the approximate size, and according to the ancient Greek maps, over here is a bit more obscure, obviously because they hadn't explored out that far, which is why I've dotted it. Part of it is ocean as well, so really we have that part there, Arabia or whatever it is. We have a bit of the upper portion of East Africa, which they called Libya, which I think is like Egypt now, but whatever it is, right? It's this big here, and included as a part of this extending. They called this part here India, but it's not truly India. It's like the Middle East. So anyways, we have a continent roughly about this size, right? So carrying that size over, not the shape, into the Atlantic, offsetting it from there, this is the location. And if you look on like Google Earth or any map and stuff, like ocean map, you'll see that there's like a ridge going down here that rises up, right, under the water. This is in the location of where Atlantis was. Okay, the text also says in Critias that there were many islands. And Timaeus also says that as well, that if you go beyond Atlantis, there's islands, and then the true continent over here, which is describing North and South America. But I'll get to that. Okay, so this is the location-wise, this is where Atlantis was. But we don't know the true shape of it, per se. So I think it probably would follow the shape of the ridge. So trying to accommodate the approximate size of Libya and Asia, okay, I've got this here. And I just use the circles to roughly amass the minimum size, okay? So carrying that over here could be a little bit larger if you took into account this unused portion, right? But generally this is what we get combined with the location. I traced it to get the distances and everything from underneath. Okay, so this would be the location and the size of Atlantis. Now what is this little depression here? This is the plain that he describes, which is about 550, 600 or so miles by about 250, 300 or so miles, represented by the white portion down within there. Okay, that was at the center of the isle. And he describes in Critias that it's a promontory, if I'm saying it correctly. Promontory or promontory. So all the way around Atlantis, he says, the edges were like a giant, like a bevel or something, like descending down into the ocean, and that they would drop off right down. So that was what the outside of Atlantis looked like. And we had this plain roughly in the middle of the great island. And that's what it's described as, an island. And islands are volcanic, and it talks about it having the best soil, the best land, very fertile, summer like most of the year. They didn't really have a winter. Where he describes a winter, he talks about rain, if I'm not mistaken. So this is also in the right zone. You know, this is Florida over here, South America here. So you would have that type of zone. Maybe up towards the north it might have been a bit colder, right? But basically it's in the right area, and that fits with the environment-wise. It was also said that there were elephants on the island, lots of great elephants. And we know that North America had elephants just, I think, 10, 15,000 years ago, not that long ago. Mastodons, mammoths, and all that. And it's very, very possible that they were here as well, possibly even naturally. But Critias itself goes into great detail that many different creatures and merchandise was brought in from all different countries around the world. So it can't be denied that elephants were just imported. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so this is the true location of Atlantis and the approximate size of Atlantis. Not definitely the shape, but probably the most logical shape following that ridge that's here. Okay, so I would reckon to guess that that ridge was in some way part of Atlantis. And the Azores is basically right here. I have it drawn out on the other one, but it's right here. And the way he talks about Atlantis, he says that when it fell, not 100% of it was down. There were peaks emerging from the water. So I highly think that they were Azores, and that some of the other islands, in the vicinity or whatever, were accredited as part of Atlantis's empire. You see what I mean? And that they still stood. It was just basically this main structure here that collapsed because of the earthquake. That's primarily what did it, not the rain and all of that there. But if it did happen at the time of the Great Flood of Deucalion, Noah, then that would have been 2345 BC. So it logically fits in on the timeline of, events, things happening. And it would have been all those great water, all that great water pressure, all those great waves combined with the earthquake, that could probably loosen it. This giant island here probably had lots of caves and underwater caves, which would, if an earthquake hit, that could be very devastating. And it's rising very high out of the water, so if it got destabilized, they could collapse. Islands can rise overnight and they can fall overnight. This happens to be a very large one, but notice that Plato called it an island, not a continent. So I think that's what we're looking at there. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's try and take a look at Critias to see what else we can divulge from here. I'm trying to avoid reading the whole text again because that took an hour, like I said the other day. So I focused on quoting the location things as most important. Let me just scroll down through here and see if I can get a quote for how it was named. The Atlantic Ocean was named after it and all of that. If I'm not mistaken, we did hear already that after it sunk, that the ocean became impassable, and this is what they call the Sargasso Sea now, which is in that area of Atlantis where there's a lot of seaweed and everything. So if you're going through it, it could give you the impression that you're plowing through thick, dense water that's full of silt and and all this plant matter, right? You might think that there's a lot of mud and muck and all that, but obviously thousands of years later, you're not going to be getting, even if a continent did sink, it's not going to be still churning stuff up yet, for hundreds or thousands of years, but I wouldn't even say for decades, you know what I mean? So I would venture to guess that maybe right after it sunk, people in boats or whatever who are still out there, who immediately ventured out there, encountered all the mud churning up and everything, possibly. But outside of that, I think that's more of a embellishment of a natural occurrence of the Sargasso Sea, okay, which could have been stimulated, the growth of all of that stuff over time could have been stimulated by the fall of that great continent going down. You never know. It could have provided a great bed for all that seaweed and all the creatures to grow in and thrive in. So that's also very possible. But nonetheless, we have that great ridge there under the water and in the right location. So that physical aspect speaks for itself as proof, supporting proof. Again, here I can quote him as calling it an island. It says here, Orichalcum was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island. Okay. He also says here, I can quote him, that it says, all these and there's, here we go. This might be where he quotes the name. Yeah, here we go. It says, and he named them all, the eldest, who is the first king, he named Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic. Okay, so for anybody to say that it's Malta or down in Antarctica, no, that's just not right. You know what I mean? And to his twin brother, who was born after him and obtained as his lot the extremity of the island towards the Pillars of Hercules, facing the country which is now called the region of Gades, which is Spain, in that part of the world. He gave the name in the Hellenic language is Eumelus, in the language of the country which is named after him, Gadarius. And later on, saving some reading, all these and their descendants for many generations were the inhabitants and rulers of diverse islands in the open sea. And also has already been said they held sway in our direction over the country within the pillars as far as Egypt and Thyrenea. Again, more proof that it wasn't in Malta. So the empire of Atlantis ruled into Asia, what the Greeks, ancient Greeks, perceived as Asia and Europe and all that there, and Libya and Egypt. That's where Atlantis had its empire. It's also talked about how Egypt descended from Atlantis. So this is all what's talked about in Critias. So they had this empire. Their epicenter was the giant island of Atlantis. There are many other islands all around it, and their empire comprised all of that. Okay, and so that's that there. Now, there's about the elephants, but I don't really need to quote that. Describing the plains is not really important, but like I said, it's about, depending on the length of the stadia, some people say it's 175, 185. One person says it's 200 miles, but nonetheless, the meters, whatever it is. But in either case, it's around 550, 600 miles. It's oblong in shape. It's at the center of the island. It's about 550, 600 miles across by about 250, 300 miles in breadth. And I know that orientation is correct because it says that the 250, 300 mile dimension is going north to south. Okay, and the other dimension, the greater one, is going west to east. So it's not really important, the orientation and the size of the plane, but if you're trying to picture Atlantis, that's that. And all the way around it, you had that huge burl, or whatever you want to call it, of the edge of the island that would just drop down into the ocean. So it had like high cliffs all the way around it where you went. Once you went up onto those cliffs, I mean, they had a port of entry, which I think is what he was talking about with the isthmus, unless he was drawing relevance to one over in Europe or Africa way. But nonetheless, right, they undoubtedly had this port that you entered in, because elsewhere was all these high cliffs. But if you're trying to access it from the outside anywhere else, you'd have to scale these high cliffs somehow, and then you'd be at the mountainous regions, which went all the way around it. So it was really well protected, and the plain was down in the middle. I don't know if it was lower elevation or higher. I don't really care. He might actually specify that in the text. But that's the general scope of it. And that tiered layout where he made all those canals and center rings and islands, that's all very, very small. Like if you were to look at it on this map here, it'd be like a dot in the center of that. It's so small. So, those are minute details. We don't really need to worry about them when we're talking about location and what Atlantis looked like, right? That was for a tiny little area. But the geological makeup of Atlantis was, obviously it was an island. It was rising up out of the sea, so it's a volcanic island. So obviously it probably was an ancient volcano, if you see what I mean. It may possibly just be, a massive like continental type thing rising up out of the ocean, like how New Zealand does today, maybe. But I mean, that's less likely to go under the water. If you had an extinct volcano with all that action and everything, you'd have a lot of caves. You probably have limestone, which is typical in the Atlantic regions. And all those limestone type of caves, which are frequently underwater, can be weakened by earthquakes. So I think it's more likely it was a volcanic island that had risen up, right? Just personally, that's what I think it was. That would explain the really rich and beautiful soil that was on it, how it could sustain crops all throughout the year, have great summer type weather throughout the year. And you don't really hear any mention of snow. Maybe on the top of the highest peaks of their mountains, maybe it got colder, maybe they got some snow up there, but still nonetheless. That's the general scope of Atlantis. So I'll read from Timaeus in a bit. I'm just scrolling down real quick here towards the end of Critias to see if there's anything else critical here. There's nothing really else that defines the geographic location of Atlantis or the size. I've gone through all the other dimensions they give, but that's for like the interior areas, like the canals and this and that there. There's no actual description of the size or like circumference or diameter of the island. It's just that it's greater than Libya and Asia combined, and that you have to go beyond it to get to the true continent of North and South America, which is in Timaeus. Okay? So beyond Atlantis, going west, you would have more ocean and more islands, and then the true continent. So it could have been, but it probably wasn't smack right up against North America. Like I said, you have 3,600 miles between New York and the Pillars of Hercules. So if Atlantis has to be this side, the eastern side, has to be 1,500 miles away, like that is from Cytheron, okay, then you don't have much left to work with. You have, what is it, 2,100 miles left. Now, one could only speculate how far this is, excuse me, how far this truly is across, because we don't know the true shape of it. So that's really speculation. But going by, fixed things that we know, we have 21 miles left here between New York and the eastern coast of Atlantis, right? We know that it's the size of, this size, Libya and Asia, okay, and that there must be ocean here with islands and then the true continent. So if you're looking at the scale here, if this is 2,100 miles, that's going to be about 1,100 right here. So, we're talking about maybe 700 something miles from how I've drawn it, like right here. And there are islands like Caribbean and this and that there. They come off around here. We have Azores up here. So they're in the right type of zone. Like, if this is how big Atlantis was, and it said they held sway over many other islands in the Atlantic, what are other islands in the Atlantic? You have some off the coast of Africa. You have the Azores, Canary Islands. You have ones higher up here as well. But, that's overcomplicating things. You have some over here in the Caribbean and stuff, right? That's the basic lookout. So those all had to be part of Atlantis, and structurally, they were not part of Atlantis's body. They're separate islands that came up at their own time. Judging by the size of Atlantis, if this was a volcano, it would have to be absolutely massive. So maybe it was some type of like small continental type structure like New Zealand or something like that. Maybe. Right? But how would it collapse overnight? You'd have to explain that somehow. But, there wouldn't be a volcano this big. I mean, maybe a volcano a couple hundred miles across, maybe. Maybe this was a volcano that erupted that killed the dinosaurs. Who knows? I don't know enough of the volcanic activity down here. I know that it was very ancient and the hot spots have moved. There's no more hot spots like around here. So, but anyways, that's just going too deep into stuff. Right, but we know that this is probably a good rough estimate, because if we were to extend the mass out here more, we wouldn't really have true ocean. Not really, you know what I mean? There wouldn't really be any true ocean left. There's not much space to come out here in. If this is 2,100 miles, and if that's 1,000 miles, 1,050 miles, and you're talking about, like I said, it's only about 700 miles right here. So if you want to bring the mass over this way more, and less down that way, then you're going to be able to see North America from the coast of Atlantis. It'd be quite crazy. So anyways, enough about that yabbering. Let's see. So Critias, I think, is finished. Nothing else geographic that we can obtain from here. So let's go over and look at Timaeus. Now, reading from Timaeus here, I've got the portion already started. Many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state in our histories, but one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor. For these histories tell of a mighty power, which unprovoked made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put an end. This is referencing the war that occurred 9,000 years ago. And if Plato lived around 360 BC, right, you could just, for the sake of ease of numbers, knock the 300 years off. We're talking about 9,000. We're talking about around 9,000 BC, way before the Great Flood of Deucalion, which is around 2345 or so. Okay, so this is an ancient war. It doesn't pin down when the flood happened. It doesn't pin down the destruction, right? But it's related, because we know Atlantis became more and more warlike, and it's when they decreed, we know from the end of Critias, that when Atlantis grew so great in pride and war strength, they wanted to go and conquer the rest of the known world. That's when the flood came to the world to stop them, right? To stop all that. It probably came for other reasons, you know what I mean, geological reasons or whatever you would call it, like earthly reasons, but, that's the story. So if you're a Greek, you believe Zeus sent it. If you're biblical, you believe God ordained the flood, you know what I mean? Or if you're an atheist, you just believe it's nature. However you want to look at it, that's how it would have happened. So it says here, this power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. For in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are called the Pillars of Hercules. So you can get a geographic confirmation again. Okay? It's across from the Pillars of Hercules. We know from the pinpointing we got earlier, it's got to be 1,500 miles over, right? So if it's 1,500 miles over, you can't go 1,500 miles up at this angle, because it's not going to be opposite the pillars, right? it can't go down that way because it won't be opposite the pillar. So it's got to be around here. And plus, he gave the description of two rivers. When he gave this distance of 1,500 miles, he also then mentioned two rivers. That determines north to south. Okay, so he gave you a west to east dimension to go off, a clue, and then a clue for north and south. So it's telling you that it's got to be in this zone. It's got to be in line with Greece and the Pillars of Hercules. Okay, so when you're at the Pillars of Hercules and you're looking out, you're going to see in the direction of Atlantis. So that's where that is. But reading on here. Pillars of Hercules. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, as was said in Critias, and was the way to other islands. There we go, right? And I think it's possible because we don't have islands sticking out here anymore. These islands maybe structurally, maybe were part of this body here. You know what I mean? Maybe they were other peaks that had risen up. So when this whole body collapsed, those peaks went with it, and we lost those islands too. That's interesting. And I think on older maps, from like the early 1300s to 1500s or whatever, somewhere around then, on some older maps, there were other islands in the Atlantic in various places that don't exist anymore. Maybe they were remnants that later collapsed due to fragility, right? So, and it was the way to other islands, and from these other islands, you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent. That's North and South America, which surrounded the true ocean. That's a reference to Atlantic Ocean. So, if you look at what the world looks like, North and South America, what do? They surround the entire true ocean. Truly. So they knew about North and South America. They weren't stupid. The ancient Greeks knew all about this. Okay, but, Atlanteans definitely knew all about it, but, later on the Greeks did, because they gained all this type of knowledge. So it says, for this sea which is within the Straits of Hercules is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance. Again, how could it be Malta? If they're drawing this reference here, like this sea which is within the Straits of Hercules. So it's the Mediterranean Sea. They're calling it a sea within the Straits of Hercules. And it's saying elsewhere that Atlantis was in the Atlantic named after Atlantis, out from the Pillars of Hercules. You know what I mean? Why would Plato give the description of 1,500-mile dimension from the Pillars of Hercules to can't remember the name now, Cythera, whatever it was, that mountain, right? If Atlantis was in that mountainous region in Greece. Like, Atlantis was not in Greece. It was in the Atlantic Ocean, right? It's a dimension going out the opposite way. Okay? So anyways, for this sea which is within the Straits of Hercules is only a harbor having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may truly be called a boundless continent. That's referencing North and South America, boundless, because they hadn't fully explored it. They might have known about it, stumbled upon it in exploration, but never really gone deep into it. And it says, now in this island of Atlantis there was a great and wonderful empire which had rule over the whole island and several others, and over parts of the continent. Isn't that interesting? North and South America. Look at all the Peruvians, the Incas, their tales of the white native tribes of giants who lived there beforehand, who had built all the dolmens, monoliths, and mounds. The Peruvian, it was the Incas on top of the mountains, all their stonework and giant walls. Well, that was built by the white native giants that lived there before. Tehuacan, or however you pronounce it, the Aztec giant temple. All those things were built by native white tribes of giants who lived there before, like the native people say themselves. These would have been the Atlanteans, right? That's why you see the same things all around the world on the same belt. You have pyramids, ziggurats, and all that type of stuff. Where? North and South America, along the Atlantean belt. Go over, carry that over into Africa. You get that too with Egypt, right? Then go over further into Asia, and you get that as well, right? So all the way around the world, and even into the Pacific Islands, around that belt, like that Atlantean-type belt near the equator, but not exactly, that's where you get all these type of civilizations and cultures. Maybe that's just the weather they enjoyed to live in. You know what I mean? But they also had elsewhere. But all around the belt there, you had pyramids, ziggurats, and stuff like that there. So that's very, very interesting, right? So it says, and over parts of the continent. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Hercules as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. This vast power, gathered into one, endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours, and the whole region within the straits. And then Solon, your country shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. So, I'll read it. She was preeminent in courage and military skill and was the leader of the Hellenes. And when the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars. But afterwards, like I said, that was an ancient war, right? But afterwards, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea, for which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, like was said in Critias, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. So that's all I need to read from Timaeus, right? So that is the true location of Atlantis, and that's all I need to continue talking on this video. I'll keep it around half an hour, but I just really wanted to prove that it's not in Malta, it's not in Antarctica, there's no possible way, okay? This is the true location. Anyways, folks, take care, everybody.